and welcome to
Red Read.
Today we are talking about Solenoid by Mircea Cărtărescu. For viewers of the channel who already know, this is already a different format because I have a guest for the first time. Do you want to be named? Is your
you can use my name.
Yeah, sweet. This is Callum, who's my housemate, and we group read Solenoid. And I figured it would be a good idea to talk about the book together, because this is a very highly recommended book. A lot of people have commented wanting me to read it, and going through reading it, I found that I actually didn't love it as much as I guess the people wanted me to. And I was really kind of honestly hating on it. And so I figured that joining forces will create some positive experience of the book, because it's sort of like when you make a video talking about it, it's kind of a gamble, right?
For sure.
You see a content creator that you like who makes a video, and then you're like, they must like this, and then you watch the video finally and they're just ripping on it. So I didn't want to do that. Basically we're going to talk about it together. We both read it. You finished it a little bit quicker than I did, because I so heavily procrastinated reading it that I ended up watching all of Breaking Bad, or watching all of Better Call Saul rather. General things. So actually, first context, talking about Cărtărescu. He's a Romanian author. This book was published, I believe, in 2015 in Romania.
I think that's right.
Yeah, and it got translated. Yeah, in 2022 by Sean Cotter. Shout out, by the way, Edith Grossman was a big pioneer for having the translator's name on the cover of the book. So props to Deep Vellum for doing that. Do you have any other Cărtărescu anecdotes? Because that's kind of all I know of him now.
No, I actually think it's funny, so while reading the book, there's some parts of it that kind of seem like they might be autobiographical, and I think it even says, so in the very first inside cover of the book flap, it says based on Cărtărescu. Is that the correct pronunciation?
Or it's Cărtărescu or something. Okay. It's got
I think I'm better off doing a normal Australian butchering
than
trying to do it correctly and sounding both pretentious and wrong. But anyways, I think, as we'll cover when we talk about what kind of book it is, you don't want to be reading it. It's much better if you don't think the author's talking about themselves as you read this book. So I really deliberately, while I was reading it, tried not to find out much about him. And it was interesting because you've kind of got this double thing where you don't want the experience, your understanding of the author to infect the text before you're ready. But also at the same time, as different events happen in the book, you become increasingly curious about what what was this guy's life like? This is how he's writing. And I guess just to conclude, what surprised me afterwards was I kind of didn't do the deep dive that I'd been planning to on him afterwards. I kind of scanned his Wikipedia page, was okay, that all kind of tracks in this way, and then didn't really feel a need to go deep into the weeds on who he was, other than to say he has been a very successful author within Romania, and seems to have found quite a lot of national fame prior to this text.
Fully. And the only sort of like you mentioned, the kind of spoiling, or not spoiling, or just tainting the work that I noticed, I think because it's part of a blurb, or maybe I read it on Wikipedia, was early on I learned that it was an unedited manuscript, allegedly unedited. So I didn't really, I would say that pretty actively affected how I was reading it, because one of the core criticisms I had for the book, where it was does the book benefit from being unedited? And I didn't really get that sense, and I kind of wanted to ask you about, or actually maybe before we get fully into it, just general thoughts. What's your if you were to sum up the book, and your experience of reading the book, what's your...
Well, I think maybe I'll lead with the interesting thing about us discussing it, and kind of your lead in about having qualms about it, is we didn't talk too much about it in the house, I think, because we knew relatively early on that we were going to have this shared experience. But it's interesting that I feel we both have a similar sense of which bits of the book we found in some sense icky or a bit awkward or whatever, and which bits we really liked as well and were way more on board with. And the real difference between our experience seems to be something to do with like how we relate to the kind of stuff that we're a little bit less sure about in the text. So I would kind of characterize the text overall as you could almost put it in the bracket of like hysterical realism, to use that term. It's very like throw everything at the wall, kind of very contemporary. It's got, I guess a part of the trend, I would say, of contemporary fiction, where it's like blending a lot of different previous styles and maybe making a particular brand of postmodernism more approachable. What I'd say for me differentiates it from a lot of those texts that I have read, like I was often thinking of Bolaño's 2666, sometimes reading it, is that it's very first person. And it struck me that it's actually very, in my experience, very rare to get a book of this size with such a willingness to like keep you in the character's perspective the whole time, because if you don't like the character, you're really stuck, whereas a lot of other thick tomes will swap you between characters so you don't get so tired.
I got the sense, weirdly enough, because I'm glad that you mentioned hysterical fiction, because it does contextualize it for me, where I had this sensation where, weirdly enough, I feel like the book isn't maximalist, which I kind of like. There's something about an almost like the kind of, it didn't feel like a book where the author was, I have thoughts on music and I have thoughts on painting, and I'm just going to like force insert it, like, in Infinite Jest you get like lots of essays about things. Whereas in this book, it does feel like, for better or worse, like Cărtărescu has these recurring motifs that he comes back to, and he will just kind of like aggressively reiterate them, and a lot of time in like really satisfying ways, where I think we both talked about the kind of page 200 to 400 reading slump, where it's just like, oh my god, I really just so can't read another dream journal written in italics. And then, afterwards, you kind of are so conditioned to be thinking about these core ideas that it starts to become like pretty awesome, actually, by the time by the time he's meeting Palomar, and Palomar's talking about the Voynich manuscript. But I had this sort of, it is like you said, it's just an ick, where I just thought, like, so much of this time spent reading this book, I'm just not liking it. And balancing like, hey, I want to be critical and I want to talk about this in a way that, highlights the book, but also, why didn't I like this? Well,
I think firstly, it's very astute of you, Nick, to pick up on the ways in which the maximalism is limited, and like I said, in Bucharest the whole time, for instance, very place specific, very in the protagonist's narration, and you're right, he doesn't spend too much time, although there is the Rubik's Cube section. But it's interesting, I guess, the way in which I would describe it as throwing everything at the wall is, you do get the sense that, for better or worse, when it was being written, the author was not thinking, is this cool? That was the last thing in his head. And I think maybe we should talk about the stuff you disliked, because that'll leave a space at the end to kind of get into the things we did really like. But just leading into that, my sense is that when there were bits of the novel which I wasn't that into, like the dreams as well, I agree, there were sections where, just especially when there were lots of like short italicized dreams with like little bits in between, I found it really difficult to even just kind of get into what was literally happening in the text. For me, I kind of saw that as like, well, this is the author who probably, if they thought more deeply about it, would have edited this stuff out. But I actually kind of like that they were willing to leave it in there. And to me, it was like double-edged with the stuff that I really liked, where I could see like, well, maybe if they edited that stuff out, they would have also gotten rid of some of the things I really do like. And you would have, and maybe this is the last thing I'll say on it, is like, the kind of ultimate ick, I think, is seeing an author trying to look cool, or trying to seem smart, I think, by putting a lot of their like knowledge in the text and trying to like seem as if they're above the reader. And maybe this is what I liked about it. I never felt like Cărtărescu was trying to seem above me, because he just did some things that were so like astonishingly tasteless that I was like, you're clearly not trying to impress me.
Yeah.
You were. You wouldn't have done that.
Yeah, gosh. So, all right, maybe I'll start with lowlights, I think. I'll take your advice, because I have some highlights, but some of them edge into being like kind of end of the novel.
Yeah.
But just rapid fire, lowlights were the overt martyrdom, any sections talking about childhood, the dreams, describing women in general, but particularly like the kind of sexual relationships. Didn't love that. And I'll say a mid-light was the bug motif, in that actually that sort of grew on me over time, but that maybe kind of helped to frame a lot of the things, because he almost sort of fanatically decided like, I need to make bugs relevant to every single thing that I'm thinking about. Should we go through them?
Maybe not, in a completionist way, but I think they're kind of I probably agree with the list, but I feel like each of them left a different taste in my mouth. So for instance, the dreams I just found annoying as interludes to the text often. Like, I wasn't like, this is like bad writing or whatever. I was just like, I get the point. We can move on. And actually, that was an area where I did draw the link to Bolaño's 2666, where... Have you read it?
Haven't read it.
Okay,
it's on the list.
If you've read it, there's a part where he describes in detail many murders that are recurring, particularly of women. And it goes on for many pages. It's quite difficult to read, but you sort of... This is an instance where, because it's kind of external, he's kind of describing a social phenomenon, you really feel like there's a value to the repetition of it, whereas the value of the repetition of the dreams was like, it was oblique to me.
A point you made that was really great. Can you talk about how like the book's already surreal? Like, why does it...
True. Yeah. And that was the other thing which came up when we were at book club was, for me, the text was already like, it was very surreal, but it was kind of, when it was surreal, it almost felt like it was, that grounding in Bucharest, that grounding in the narrator's life, lent it this air of plausibility. And then you'd enter the dreamland and it was like no weirder, but just like less important or impactful on the author. Was that your sense as well?
Yeah, fully. And I like probably the coolest image, or the redemption, which was like a highlight, was just the scene of seeing like that, almost that like community, that sack pustule on the bottom of the floating, like that was where all these like sleep paralysis demons come up from. I was like, that is so cool. It almost made me think it was worth reading this stuff. But that was the biggest time where I just felt like, I generally don't like reading books and think like literally feeling like this page, like this book could have been smaller. I generally, I so covet the opposite feeling of just like, Don Quixote was like this, where you get halfway through and you realize that the book's not big enough. Like, like it could be so good. But
what about the childhood?
Yeah, there were a couple of things. So it felt like there were a couple of motifs that came up that were either unnecessary or like, I can't say that it's plagiarized, because he literally mentions the notebooks of Malta Lawrence Brigger, but he has this scene where he talks about his mother raising him as a girl for a period, which like mirrors Rilke's life and is talked about in the notebooks of Malta Lawrence Brigger to a really, I think, interesting effect in that book. But with this one, and also with talking about his twin brother, did I miss something? Like what did you get out of that? Because I felt like that was a bit of an abandoned thread.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, because there's some things in the novel, or there's some novels that you might compare this to, where I'm just gonna say Murakami.
Let's do it.
I know it's not the best comparison, but what I'd say is like, if you are a person who likes Murakami, you kind of know not to expect anything to be followed up ever. You're just like, stuff's just happening in the text. There's probably not going to be a payoff. And the interesting thing about Solenoid is lots of it does pay off at the end. Like lots of things that are recurring throughout the book, and are these motifs do become important towards the end of the texts. So I guess then the threads that are dropped, like the twin thread, you're kind of like,
yeah,
where was that?
It kind of came up in that fragment from a Kafka story where he talks about like the melting into the mirror, the Ishtar, but
I mean, he has the twin with the literal Cărtărescu, I think, is like the one that comes through most at the end of the novel, you know, this sense that like he's the only one that could have written this book. And there's kind of the double irony of the fact that, well, like actually, in fact, in a literal sense, this book, which ostensibly could only be written by someone who was not successful, was in fact written by Cărtărescu, the very successful Romanian author.
Yeah.
And I feel like you could like unspool that paradox at length and wonder if the text is in a sense self-refuting and if that's part of the joke. And maybe that's why or where the twin content leads you to.
Yeah. I would say that for me, one of the lowmost point heights was, look at me not writing a novel. Like, that was a very, very consistent ick for me. I just, like, I do love when books kind of sort of physically justify themselves. And there's a cool thing where that happens with A Naked Singularity by Della Pava, where there's just this almost awesome moment where like the book collapses on the end when you turn the final page. But like, and again, this is probably just a purely biased ick, but like I generally don't despise when books are talking about being a failed author, and especially when, you know, like you said, you are actually in real life a like published and successful author. And I kind of just didn't, because I didn't buy it for how autobiographical it is. I was like, well, what am I going to get out of it? Like, if I hear someone talking about feeling like they're martyred because they went to a book club and they read a poem that was kind of mocked, and I'm just like, okay, this is so melodramatic that you've got to do something with it. Like, you've got to develop it in some way that's, like, you can't be serious, right? Like, that was my thing. And
so it's interesting. Maybe I'll just pull in there, because I think weirdly what made that bearable for me, and this was definitely one of the things that I think for sure, like, firstly, like, book about an author being failed, where they mostly complain about their lives, and they're like a dude as well on top of it. It's like there's lots of variants of this that exist in literature. So to kind of read it again in like a prize-winning novel in 2025, you can imagine some people would just look at that and be like, what? Like, you know, haven't we kind of moved on? You were mentioning kind of not knowing what to do with the sincerity of it. And for me, I think, again, that was what maybe not salvaged it, but almost what made it like entertaining and engaging, was it just felt so incredibly sincere. And in fact, like, the protagonist is not, I think, critiqued by the text in a way that maybe they would be in a kind of more Western or Anglosphere version of the novel. And I think like that I would find more annoying if there was kind of this character and the text was like using him for parody or satire about a particular kind of guy, whereas presenting him and letting him like show himself fully, I thought was a much more interesting choice, because it kind of almost forces you to do that work, like, if you want to. I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's a great point.
Because it's not like, I think you read him and you're kind of like, mate, like, is it all really so dark? Like, that's kind of the thought you have. But you are kind of, I found myself convinced that for him, it really was, you know, for whatever kind of internal socio-cultural reasons existed for him. And it's interesting that, like, actually, that's a direction in which can be quite difficult to extend empathy. Especially in literature. And again, you've got the double of like, it's interesting that like, so you've got the scene where the character like presents their poem, and this is a scene I remember you were not that into. I thought it was very funny. That was the other thing. I think a lot of this stuff I just thought was hilarious. But so he presents his poem, and the famous poet is like, this is terrible. And maybe one reading of the text is Cărtărescu, who is in the real world, like, he's more like the poet, critiquing the text.
Yeah.
It's interesting that he has written this novel and actually said, like, I guess by virtue of publishing under his name, like, actually, like, it's good. He's seen this person who's come full of ambition and maybe like too much of it, who's like too self-involved, and Cărtărescu's kind of been like, actually, like, that's okay. And it would, as the poet, he's kind of giving it his stamp of approval instead of tearing it down.
Yeah, gotcha. Yeah, part of it was a personal baggage, and I think it came from, like, there's sort of two things that, and they're almost just like, they are personal baggage that I just bring to the novel, where one of them is sort of like, in the same way that The Name of the Rose taught me that I just can't read detective novels because, like, that should have convinced me that I like it. This book also was like the kind of most poetic ways of talking about absurdism, nihilism, like specks of dust, insignificance, etc. But that shit is just such a like teeth grinding. Like, I just despise that so much.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's something I need to move on from, but I just found that was like I just can't cop it. I don't know. And it really, like, I don't really know how to describe it. I just like that was an ick. And then also just like coming from reading, I think I was also spoiled from reading Flaubert, who had a very literally similar experience with his friends telling him to like burn a manuscript that he wrote. And when there are this certain nihilism, and I'm probably not fully opposed to nihilism, because there are certain things, like I still love reading like Samuel Beckett and whatnot.
Would you describe it as nihilistic though, the text? I would say existential.
Yeah, like,
I mean, it's funny because he's got worse. Another bit that you were a bit ick about was the where he's having the argument with his girlfriend Irene. Is that right?
Irina's the
about whether he'd save a child or the painting.
Yeah.
He's pretty explicit, like, you've got to save the kid. So the protagonist, at least, is certainly, I wouldn't describe them as nihilistic.
Yeah. I don't know if I bought that, to be honest. Like, and it comes back at the end in a really cool way, but like, maybe it was just this kind of dissonance of like, always being aware of like, you're telling me these things that are literally not true because I'm holding the manuscript that was allegedly destroyed, to the point where I just had this almost like distrust or skepticism that turned into distrust for the book. And
do you think, like, what would be the text that's like most similar to this that you like?
Well, actually, the book I read just after was Clarice Lispector's Agua Viva, which weirdly enough had like eerily similar themes, where like just talking about even to the point of talking about like, destroy this writing at the end. But in this book, Lispector is kind of trying to capture the present moment, and she's like in a very obtuse way just trying to like reach this author, but like reach the reader as the author. But I still felt a lot of the same icks in this. But
what do you think's at the heart of the? Because I think it's always interesting, like, and yeah, maybe like, I don't know if you draw this distinction between kind of like just personal likes and preferences in text, and kind of if you took a step back, like what you think the text merits from a more neutral standpoint, if that's possible. And yeah, I guess it seems like there's these, concerns the text has and ways of presenting its protagonist, which have like tread on some tripwires for you. And I was wondering like what you think the core of that is. Like, is it that you've just come across that stuff a lot in literature? Is it like a fear that maybe that's something that like is a bit too close to home? Is like,
well, what I'd say, it's almost like it's definitely not close to home is something that I've realized, like, and I'm still in very early stages of wanting to talk about like my own writing, but I would maybe say that the writing that I'm doing now is at the risk of kind of hitting a tripwire for you of having like the narrator as being almost like parodied, because that is something that like I'm trying to set out to do. But for me, the idea is like fun has become such a fundamental part of the way that I want to live and want to enjoy things, that I'm not like, I don't want to project that on other people, but I find that there's this kind of like, I'm really trying to find this delicate balance of like great erudition then coming to being like, you know, wanting it to be for the good of people. I don't know, or just like at least bring joy. I didn't necessarily get that. There's a kind of bleakness. I don't know, but it's not the bleakness of like in Saturn Tango, like Crash and Hawkeye writes like really bleak, and it's just like incredible how he does it. I didn't feel like it's like that whole book is in black and white. But I didn't necessarily feel that with this.
It almost sounds like your concerns with the text are less aesthetic and more moral.
Probably, yeah.
Which I think is a valid position from which to critique a text.
Yeah. But like,
or is it the other way around? Is it like, so is it like the aesthetics of having this like kind of narrator kind of complaining about stuff and like they're martyring themselves? Is it just like those kinds of sentences which you're like, you find distasteful from an aesthetic standpoint? Or do you actually kind of think like there's some way in which the novel presents those things in a way that's like so dour or whatever that it's like not, it's in some very essential way like not good for the reader?
Possibly. I think maybe there's a sense of like this, because something that will happen is I'm just trying to think of novels that either like don't do that. So for example, a novel that the book I read just before this was Musil's The Man Without Qualities, where yes, like the main character has this sense of like kind of being a Musil surrogate, but Musil is still so fundamentally concerned with creating as fleshed out characters as possible,
right,
such that like less happens in that book than in, I don't know, like Ulysses or something. Like there's so little action that happens, and yet it's still so rich and detailed. Maybe then another reverse is, and I know that this is a very elegantly written story, but maybe I'm kind of realizing that elegant poetry isn't appealing to me, because a line that I really remember and really stuck with me from one of Samuel Beckett's trilogies, in sort of maybe sort of nihilism, but probably still existential, is that the narrator talks about having this sense that he was birthed out of his mother's ass, not out of her vagina. And I just remember reading that and thinking like that's the most beautiful way, because Beckett has this sense of like life is shit and I am shit. And then when Cărtărescu was talking about like specks of dust floating on a planet and again, that's such a trigger that I need to stop saying it because, you know, whatever, but then the novel is still feels so very me that I'm like, I think you really think you are special. And that was probably my personal.
Just when you say you think you are special, do you mean Cărtărescu, the author, or the protagonist?
Like the protagonist in so much as that I didn't like. I was pretty convinced of like the I being the protagonist, not necessarily Cărtărescu. Like the only time where I think things bled through would have been the dream sequences, because I can really believe that that's like the sort of dreams that he would have had, or like had some sleep paralysis experiences and then just written it down. But the character was consistent within the world. I didn't feel like there was any blending in that sense. But so maybe I'm not criticizing Cărtărescu, but just the narrator, I'm like, I didn't believe that he would have saved the child, actually. I really just didn't buy that. There is this sense of such a like disregard of really trying to describe or flesh out any other character that I just felt like it's still so much like this narrator, this consciousness of the narrator is the focus and the only thing that seems valuable in this novel. Like everything else to me felt like a means. I don't know.
I guess it raises an interesting question about like how you view the end of the novel, because he kind of raises Bucharest, maybe saves it from the paralysis demons, and gets his wife and kid out, like gets them out and then later marries her. But it's interesting, like to draw a very strange comparison. That's almost like the Alice Walker, The Colour Purple ending, where it's like, given the context of everything that precedes it in the novel, there's like, the real reading of that ending is like, probably what actually happened is they saw the sleep demons and they were like, oh no, and then it all settled back and they just went back to their lives as before.
Yeah.
It's like, do you really believe that any of these like creatures were, prevented by him throwing his book in or whatever?
Yeah. And again, I'm like, maybe I just missed it, but it felt like a Colour Purple, having your cake and eating it too, where I'm just like, but you didn't throw the book out. Like, where? Like, if this book was discovered, like Beowulf was discovered or something, or, just like... Yeah.
I wonder if I think he threw it in. So I'll maybe say, like, one more thing on the lowlights, and then we can maybe move on to some of the things we really liked about the text. Because there was a lot to like about it, for sure. So I think a version of this that I didn't like was Paul Auster's 4321, if anyone's read that. And it is basically the author doing kind of 4 different versions of their life with like these different sliding door moments. And it's also based on the author. And it's also most of the versions of the protagonist are relatively self-involved. They're kind of like journalists who can only be neutral observers who never like get into the politics or whatever. And they're also quite dark, not quite as dark as this. But I found 4321 like totally unbearable by the end. And it was I guess because, and this is the distinction I draw with this, because I actually found it like not fun, precisely because Paul Auster was so careful with his editing that it was like so clean that you almost just became tired of being in this like kind of perfect world with perfectly constructed sentences where like nothing too weird ever happened. And the best bit in that, I thought, was like there's this like tiny section where the child version of one of them writes a section about like the life of the soul of a boot that goes on for like 10 pages, and that's great because he finally threw it out there. And I guess but the contrast with Cărtărescu is like Cărtărescu's like so messy that you feel at least like you're really like in there seeing them. And maybe maybe this is what I'd say is like I feel like the protagonist lets you see themselves. And that's maybe they're not like a good, well, yeah, they're definitely very flawed, but at least they've got that ability to open themselves up to you, the reader, in some sense.
Yeah, that's a good segue into highlights. Quick ones for me. So, I liked some of them we've already talked about, but like also talking about, there's a kind of, I liked the comfort in the virtuosity when he's talking about the Bull family and like the, yes, the Voynich manuscript sections, but like the Rubik's Cube sections and whatnot. There's maybe that's like hit some personal like pleasures and delights for me. But also, again, the big highlight, probably the best like framing thing for reminding you that he's not just like a ghost walking through Bucharest and that there are actually people there, is the picketists. And all of those scenes just hit a lot of the delightful, like kept the story moving, and so they increased momentum of the novel whenever it happened. But also, funnily enough, I found that like people like picketing against death was something that was exactly like the absurd, like, okay, I get that, like give it to me, let's go for it, I'm in on the joke. And of course, like the scenes, and another great insight that you had was like the surrealism of the book is probably the best that you're going to get in like I haven't read a whole lot of surrealist stuff, but like some of the scenes are just so good, and a lot of the Picketer scenes are that good, also with going to the factory, and that's almost just like purely entertaining stuff. I wouldn't say that those are like philosophical nuggets or anything, but just you also like want to have fun when you read the book. So like that stuff was so good, and I would say that I ended up erring on not feeling like the rest of the book was worth it. But if you like some of that stuff, you have to get it from this book. What were your highlights, or did you have anything on those?
I've wanted to ask you, since you've finally finished it, what did you think of him becoming Jesus of the Mites?
Honestly, that was okay. I gotta really think about it. I wish he went more. Like that should have just been like 20 pages. I really wanted him to like flesh that out. I thought it was such an awesome like description with like Palomar talking about it. It was like exactly that great like disgustness, which comes up like that's the first line of him talking about having lice, and so you're kind of always thinking of insects as this kind of like ecosystem. But I just thought that's something that I wish that section was like 5 times the length.
Yeah. Well, that's good that you wished it was longer.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that was a huge highlight. Jesus of the Mites. Once I realized it was going to happen, I just... I don't know, there's this like kind of internal laughter that I feel like is a very unique part of the reading experience. There's not that many other forms of art where you just like it's kind of funny in such a deep way that it can never exit your body, and it just becomes this like internal shuddering. Like
that's so good, yeah.
So that was great, and it felt like unbelievably justified in the sense of the text. Like, you know, there's that like shade that people sometimes cast at magic realism where they're like, oh, it's, you know, neither magical enough to be magic or real enough to be real. But sometimes Solenoid hit the spot where it was like both simultaneously. Like, it was like, it felt so real that he became a mite. But also you were just like, this is, you know, you're not getting this without reading Solenoid. Like,
fully.
So that was good.
I would say that the book always like did a good job of teetering. Like, I never really believed that it was a literary work or that it was a sci-fi work, but I got kind of like they basically just ebbed and flowed. And I'd say it was much more on the literary side, but then some sci-fi stuff reads pretty literarily, like, you know, maybe another similarity or a similar book was Solaris.
Yeah.
But yeah, and maybe another way of trying to refute and salvage my opinion of the novel is that this is the only book that I've ever experienced this sense of, or I'll reveal that after. A lot of the time, if I read a book that I don't actually enjoy, or I think I don't enjoy, I'll be reading it and just kind of sucking it up. I'm like, oh, I'm not loving it. I felt that with The Handmaid's Tale, and I felt that with probably like Madame Bovary and Butcher's Crossing as well. But then thinking about it in hindsight, I'm like, oh, okay, that was actually a pretty great experience of reading it. But Solenoid was the opposite, because thinking about needing to go and read the book caused so much dread and procrastination that, again, like, I did the maths and I think I spent on average like 4.5 hours a day watching Better Call Saul.
It was great. Can I, like... Nick walked into the kitchen one day and was like, I think, you know, I've got a bit of time in the day to just watch a bit of TV. And I was like, he was like, oh, I might watch Breaking Bad. I was like, oh, you could try Better Call Saul, because he'd already seen Breaking Bad. He was like, oh, I don't think so. And the next time I spoke to Nick, you were literally like halfway through season 4. It was incredible. You gone from I'm not going to watch it to just being more than halfway through the show.
Yeah. I relearned the hard way. Like, it was like, oh, I'm trying to think of an example. It was like just dusting off these old like video game chops.
Yeah.
And I was just like, wow, this is...
It's crazy, like, when you... Man, maybe this is a bit of a Solenoid thing, but like, you think you're like a different person, and then like your life changes by an inch, and you're like, oh no, like they're still inside me. Like, I'm still just a disgusting, like slimy little like computer screen addict. Like managed to like put a veneer of liking books over the top of it. It's like you're like one of the things I loved most was just the like constant descriptions of people with like it was like he knew so much about insect biology that like, you know, it wouldn't just be like, oh, the person's exoskeleton, it'd be like their carapace. Like, and like the ability to be super detailed about the various, you know, I guess relationships between different forms of embodiment and the different bodies of creatures, and kind of like reorganizing the hierarchy of existence or the tree of life was like very cool. Like it would be hard to finish a session and not just like feel like you would literally been disembodied by reading a book, and like you know, like you're kind of like reading it on your pillow, and then you're like checking the pillow.
Oh man, because the problem is that I always just am like, and this is like, do I just have to get over feeling like I didn't like it? I don't know. Because maybe I did like it, because, you know, like when I would come back to it, I'm like, okay, I'm in it, and it's not poorly written, and it's entertaining and everything, and I don't know how much to, like, at what point do you decide to consciously override that gut instinct of like, oh, I just didn't like this, you know?
I think there's like a totally valid reaction to a text, which is like, it's not for me, but it's good. And like, there's lots of texts that I have that response to, but I think it's always interesting. Like sometimes it's more interesting when you don't like a text, and especially like, you know, the worst thing to be from a text is like bored, or to think like it's just okay. If you're reading a text and like you're like, this is so horrible, like I can barely bear to get back to it, but also there's these bits that are really good, like that to me is in a way a successful text. And maybe it's like, you know, the viewer's less about did I or did I not like this book in some binary way, but like bird's eye view, like what do I think about books that can make me experience this multitude of reactions like that. And that's kind of what it pulls off, right? Like I feel like, I don't know, this is maybe like my little bit about like myself as a writer, but like the worst response someone can give to your text is like, interesting. If I show someone something and they're like, this is disgusting, I hate it, like how could you? I'm like, well, if someone feels that poorly about it, there's going to be someone else out here there who's going to have the, like, at least it did something in the world. And it's funny because I feel like that's actually, I wonder if this is your view of your text, because I feel like the protagonist of this probably has that view of their own writing. Like they would much rather elicit the disgust reaction than no reaction or a bland reaction, and they're like proud of that.
That will definitely be, because there was a section as well where the narrator talks a lot about like the only books that ought to be written, which is pretty early on, and I only noticed it flicking back to find extracts, but it's like, at the time it was a general, I was still kind of generally icked, but it's at least consistent with the character, and that like the book is consistent. That's something I want to like at least emphasize, is that it's unbelievable how well it was written actually, and that it just so didn't synchronize with my tastes.
But for sure.
How, I mean, like, I don't dig like number rankings or anything, but you mentioned that you think it might be kind of like, how would you rank it in terms of books published in the 21st century and like in your personal canon? Like how did you, because I remember you saying that you felt like it would be like a stage of your life, like you'll kind of remember reading this, or like
definitely. Interesting question. That's a very interesting question, Nick. No, just kidding. I feel like it's going to be, in a weird way, like more of an important book to me personally than the amount I liked it as a reader. And what I mean by that is, I feel like it's loosened me up as a writer in a very positive way. And it's made me feel okay about some of the things that I often perceive as weaknesses in my writing that I try to, round off the edges. And in a funny way, which is like, I guess, yeah, like as I kind of described, like reading the book, I'd often hit these bits where I'd be like, oh, I don't know about that. But ultimately, I'm having a good time. And it kind of made me feel okay about, like, actually, maybe with my own writing, that is how I can respond to some parts of it. That, like, it's maybe like, there's something about leaving the spots on the apple that's good. As in terms of my own personal response to the book, I think, it was probably a bit too uneven for it to be top. Like, in terms of contemporary-ish books I've really, really liked, like, I'd probably put it below Susanna Clarke's Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. Probably not up there with, like, Don DeLillo's Underworld as well, like, just to throw out some random kind of big books that I really liked. But I think it's, like, just below that tier. Like, a book that I'm really glad that I've read. I'll probably return to it at different times. Actually, maybe this is the last thing I'll say about, like, my personal response is, like, there's a kind of person that I'll recommend this book to, and there's a lot of people I won't. And I'd say the things on my list that I'm like, there's things that, like, I'll recommend to you knowing that they're not your cup of tea. Like, I'll be like, Nick, like, even though you wouldn't usually read this sort of thing, if you're going to, like, this is the book to read. Yeah. And I guess, like, if someone's not into surrealist, existentialist, like, throwing it at the wall literature, this isn't the book I'm giving them. Yeah. But if you are into it, take it. Yeah. Absolutely.
That's a great round off. Are there any other thoughts you had, or
maybe my one won a prize. Yeah. And Nick's didn't. So that's why I liked it.
But that's because I'm an OG. I bought this before Cărtărescu won the Dublin Award. Yeah.
Right. Whereas I knew I was following the crowd. Yeah. I actually think this testimonial, if Hanke and Nausgaard dropped acid together in a Bucharest exterminator's abandoned ship, with only Kafka's metamorphosis for company, this is the sort of autofiction their combined brain might then produce. A fractal shattered shaker of pan-galactic gargle blaster straight to the dome of 21st century letters. What do you think about that?
I mean, what was that line again? Pan-galactic...
Gargle blaster.
Pan-galactic gargle blaster.
Have you read Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy?
I have, not enough to remember it. Okay. It was too long ago, but...
That's the alien drink that, like, makes you hungover for the rest of your life.
Oh, okay. I only remember Babelfish from it. I'm gonna do some prognosticating right now. I feel like I'm gonna want to forget this book for a long time, but it's never gonna leave me.
Yes.
That's sort of my sense of this.
The book, ironically, to misuse the word ironically, has become the kind of parasite that it describes in your life. It's just sucking up your brain place. Yeah. You can't get rid of it. You've acquired the literary equivalent of a louse, Nick. Yeah. Well, the next video, Nick's going to have the beard's going to be shaved.
I've just got no eyebrows. Well,
you have no hair. He can explain that.
Thank you. There's a person who comments on my videos sometimes who he actually once left a comment that was so vile that it got, like, flagged by YouTube. Which is funny. But shout out to Eden for acknowledging that I don't have hair. Shout out to you, Callum, for joining me in this slightly stuffy room to talk about Solenoid. If we were to, firstly, to the viewers who have been patient enough to stick through it, how do you feel about this? Do you recommend we group read something again together? And now knowing the two of our tastes, are there anything you recommend that we read? And is there anything off the top of your head? Because you mentioned, like, books that you'd recommend to me that, like, maybe I wouldn't necessarily love, but I really like the experience of group reading something with you. So if you have like something in the future, is there anything any plans or any books you want to read?
I think it'd be nice to go the other way, Nick, because we've kind of done one that I'm a little... And actually, we have pretty different tastes, I'd say. We've got this, like, area in the center. I think we're both just very into kind of classics that are older, but when it comes to... I think basically when it comes to 21st and 20th century literature, our tastes diverge quite a lot. Like, I'm a bit more bordering on genre fiction stuff. I read a bit more sci-fi, kind of borderline territory, whereas you read a lot more like European literature that I've never heard of.
I would say that probably like post the modern, anything post like modernist period has to be postmodern for me to kind of vibe.
Yeah. But I'd love to tackle some of those texts. So readers, pick your poison. Do you want to force Nick to read Murakami or me to read someone whose name I can't pronounce?
Yeah, let's do The Melancholy of Resistance and then 1Q84 if you haven't read that.
Not that one.
All right, groovy. Right. Well, thank you all for watching. I don't know. I think the next video 4 weeks from now will be on Robert Graves' The White Goddess, which I've recently started reading and it's kind of cool. But yeah, let us know again if you have a desire for Callum to rejoin on the channel, and I'll see you all in the next video. So also, by the way, the channel Read Red is you can say it in one of 4 ways.
Okay.
So how do you want to say it?
Read Red.
Yeah, that's like the kind of default way, but you can either say like read or read.
Whoa.
So what's your
Read Red read.
Mm-hmm.
What's Red read? I like Red read.
Red read. All right, sweet. So let's get it started. And maybe, do you want to shuffle over? Because I want you to cut out. So yeah.
Maybe even a little closer. Yeah, there we go.
All right, nice.
Should I be further?
I think
a little further back.
I like when it's even because I wanted it to be an accurate representation of our height differences.
Yeah,
because I was like, if I'm sitting on that chair, then I'll be too tall. But if you're sitting on that chair, it'd be like...
You should be like Tom Cruise, man. Have it written in the contract before the episode that you need to be like taller than me in every part of the frame.
You do the Gandalf thing where you'll be like sitting back
like
there.
halfway through the interview. I like that.
All right, let's rock and roll. So, hello and welcome to